So Trump's son, Don Jr., and former campaign manager Paul Manafort will be interviewed by the Senate Intel Committee staff. Now, we don't know the exact date on that, but they will answer questions and provide requested documents. Joining me now for this big week ahead, CNBC's editor-at-large, John Harwood, former CIA military analyst Tara Mueller, Alex Little, a former assistant U.S. attorney, Brian Darling, and former Rand Paul staffer and founder of Liberty Government Affairs. Great to have you all here, and I know we have a lot to talk about. John, let's dive in. And why wouldn't the president be curious about pardon powers, John, especially since it's become public knowledge that officials on the Trump team have misled to get their security clearances, specifically in the case of the AG, Jeff Sessions, suspected of potentially perjuring himself for a cabinet confirmation? Wouldn't it be appropriate for the president to learn about pardon power?
Well, the biggest reason you wouldn't talk about pardon power, Thomas, is if you were confident that nobody around you or you yourself had not committed any crimes. Obviously, the president, by raising the issue with Anthony Scaramucci, as he just described, is thinking about it because it's potentially relevant, because there's a chance that people will be convicted of crimes. And make no mistake about it, we've heard various people speculate that Special Counsel Robert Mueller is some sort of Democratic hack. That is 100% baloney. Robert Mueller is as straight as they come. And if he ends up finding reason to charge people, then this issue will, in fact, be squarely on the table. And meantime, it was useful that Scaramucci cleared up the contradiction. Jay Sekulow said it hadn't been discussed. And in the first service he may have performed as communications director, Anthony Scaramucci let us know that that was wrong. In fact, it has been discussed.
But, John, is there a distinction, though? Because Scaramucci did say when it came to the question about how the White House team would communicate with the personal legal team, that they were going to be operating in different zip codes. So should they be on a better page when it comes to language or questions of such a nature?
Well, I don't think they are operating in different zip codes, Thomas. The legal team is supposed to try to handle the bulk of the response, but Anthony Scaramucci was out talking about it this morning, and the question is the president talking about this or not? And he cleared that up for us.
So, Brian, let's go to this major question, because the Russian hacking, that is being taken seriously, and we know how Congress feels about it, but Scaramucci was saying today that it's all nonsensical. Take a listen to this.
The president's not going to have to pardon anybody because the Russian thing is a nonsensical thing. I was there early on in the campaign. I didn't have any interactivity with Russians. I didn't see anybody have any interactivity with Russians. It is a complete bogus and nonsensical thing. And this is the stuff that happens in Washington I honestly don't like. It's Scandals Incorporated.
All right, so meanwhile, we compare that to what the former CIA chief Michael Hayden Friday said, calling it, quote, the most successful covert operation in history. So, Brian, how can Americans trust the president is really going to be tough on Russia if he doesn't take the conclusion of the intelligence agencies that Russia meddled in the election seriously?
Well, I think the president should. I mean, I do think that the Russians meddled in our election. I don't think there's much dispute about that. But I do agree with Anthony Scaramucci that there's nothing that they have to worry about getting pardoned, because there's no evidence that there was collusion between the Trump campaign and Russians. What the problem is...
No, what about those? I mean, how can you say that definitively? Because of the emails that were made public by Don Jr. that would provide the opportunity, that spoke specifically about a trade of information.
Yeah, right. I mean, what do those emails show? They show that some individuals who are Russian may have been operating on behalf of the Russian government, reached out and said, hey, we have disparaging information about Hillary Clinton. And so, and the accusation was that Hillary Clinton was in cahoots with the Russians, that she was maybe getting money from the Russians and her campaign getting funded by the Russians. That's not a crime. I mean, no matter how you slice it, that's not a crime. The problem is they're setting up a series of perjury traps in Congress for Don Jr., for Kushner, for Manafort, and their big problem that they have to worry about is lying under oath. It's not actually being accused, because nobody really believes that there was actual collusion between the campaign. There's evidence that there was some communication that doesn't look great for the Trump campaign, but again, no definitive proof that the Trump campaign was colluding with Russians to fix the election.
Well, this is the only information that we've gotten so far, and Alex, most of what Robert Mueller and other intelligence agencies, whether it's Senate Intel or what House Oversight is doing, is classified. That has not been put out there in the public sphere as of yet. But as Brian brings up, Alex, these perjury traps, how big of that is a problem as Manafort, Don Jr., and Jared face tough questions on the Hill?
It's a huge problem, both obstruction and perjury. There's a whole host of statutes that could apply to different types of obstruction of Congress, obstruction of justice for the special counsel's investigation. But you generally don't lie about things unless you're worried about hiding them. And I think if I put my investigator's shoes on, I see that as smoke. And I understand why, if I'm a Republican communications director, if I'm somebody on the Hill who's in the GOP, I don't want to believe that there was collusion here. But the Trump family and those around it are acting like there was. And I think it's going to trip them up time and time again if they keep trying to lie about it, which they've done.
Well, and meanwhile, we've had to witness Kushner amend security forms, adding more than 100 foreign contacts that he had. More recently, his personal finance disclosure saying he inadvertently omitted more than 70 assets that load up to about $10.5 million. So, Tara, if Congress is seeing that there was any connective tissue here, right, and these emails expose something, at least a meeting, and we don't know if anything happened afterward, although both sides say there was no follow-up, is it best that they follow the money, and that's going to be the big-ticket item that the Senate and House and Mueller are going to be looking for?
I think what you're going to see is actually a multifaceted investigation, and I think by the end of this week, Congress should have a lot more in terms of documents and a lot more in terms of testimony from Kushner, from Manafort, from Donald Trump Jr., not just about the meeting itself, which is clearly problematic, but about this pattern of basically non-transparency. And I think that's where the administration has gotten itself into a lot of problems. Non-transparency on the SF-86 form is a big issue. It's a particularly big issue when your administration and campaign associates are under investigation about one of the very issues that's at the crux of the SF-86 form, which I previously filled out when I used to work as an analyst at CIA. Part of it asks for the disclosure of those types of contacts, and these forms, in this case, had to be revised. We've seen a pattern of misleading information about meetings with the Russians, the latest one being particularly problematic. We still don't know what transpired during that meeting. So I think you raise a good point about following the money, and I think Mueller's going to do that. But I think some of this might go beyond the money. There's a look into the digital operations. There's a look into how perhaps the Russians knew to target certain areas during the campaign. And again, we don't have the evidence yet of collusion, but the investigation is underway, and there clearly are bits of evidence, and there's clearly a lot of smoke, and there's clearly lots of dots that hopefully the investigation, if there is something to be found, will connect and find. I think that's the purpose of the investigation. So I don't want to jump to a conclusion, but we clearly have a lot of evidence pointing to a pattern of hiding significant information about contacts to Russia, significant problematic contacts with Russia, and significant problematic financial dealings potentially on top of that.
Brian, do you agree, especially when it comes to what Tara points out, this lack of transparency, the fact they're always playing catch up and allowing another shoe to drop that exposes something that makes folks paranoid and very suspicious?
Let me agree and disagree. I do agree that the constant dripping of information out and the information coming out where it shows that some Trump administration officials have contradicted themselves on a number of occasions. Politically, that's a problem. I don't think legally it's a big problem because ultimately the allegations that the Trump campaign was in collusion with the Russians, I don't think that's true. There's no evidence of it. It is a fishing expedition and a witch hunt in one sense that now all these individuals are being hauled before Congress.
But Brian, it started out, I've never had any contact with a Russian. I don't know any Russians.
Right.
Then it turns out that everybody, it's like a Where's Waldo with Sergei Kislyak. They've all had contact with him in some way, shape, or form. Jared Kushner's looking for a back channel way to have communications with Russia that cannot be picked up by the NSA. Then we find out that there's this big meeting in Trump Tower. The emails revealed by Don Jr. himself that they were promised dirt on Hillary Clinton.
Right.
So are you just willing to pass a blind eye to what might be right in front of your face?
No, I can see it. And you know what I see? I see that they had a meeting at Trump Tower where they were promised one big swath of information about Hillary Clinton colluding with the Russians, and it was a bait and switch. They never had the information. These Russians just wanted to get in to pitch the reduction of sanctions against Russia and they wanted to talk about the adoption issue too. We all know that all they cared about was a political issue of getting rid of the Russian sanctions, but they bait and switch the Trump campaign saying, hey, we got all this great stuff about Hillary Clinton, and then when the Trump campaign heard the information, they basically ended the meeting. So they weren't acting like a campaign that wanted to be in collusion on that very issue in that very meeting.
That's not actually true, though, because the fact that they took the bait actually shows that there is a willingness, that there was a willingness, and we don't actually know what transpired during that meeting. We haven't seen a transcript. We don't know what happened during that meeting.
Real fast, Don Jr. went on Hannity and said that it was, such a shame that they didn't get the dirt that they were looking for. Also said this was everything when it wasn't. There was more to come. John, I'm going to give you the last word here.
Well, first of all, why in the world would anyone believe the account of what happened in that meeting from people who initially declined to disclose the meeting in the first place, or believe the Russians' account for that matter? That's first of all. Second of all, we have a clear through line here, which is Donald Trump being approached by someone offering to provide damaging information and saying that he discussed adoptions. Adoptions is code for sanctions because the end of the adoption program came out because of the sanctions. The President of the United States said in the second meeting that he had with Vladimir Putin at the G20, which was also undisclosed, he told the New York Times that they discussed the adoption issue. Again, they discussed adoptions/sanctions in the original meeting when negative information was offered, and they discussed sanctions in the meeting afterwards when he's President of the United States. Guess what happened in between? The Russians hacked the DNC and Hillary Clinton emails and dumped a lot of damaging information out.
All right, so guys, I'm going to ask you to stick around. Tara Mahler, thank you very much for being with us and great insight when it comes to intelligence angles on this. Gentlemen, we're going to come back to this.